Yes, Ms. Hodge.
Thank you, sir. Our next witness is Mr. Mark Kelly.
Could you stand up, please? Take the Bible in your right hand and repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Kelly, my name is Catriona Hodge, as you know,
Yep.
and I ask questions on behalf of the inquiry. Please, can you state your full name?
My full name is Mark Francis Brian Kelly.
Thank you. Mr. Kelly, you made a statement on the 20th of January of this year, is that correct?
Yes.
Do you have a copy of that statement in front of you?
Yeah.
Please, could you turn to the final page of your statement at page 20?
Yes.
Is that your signature at the top of the page?
Yes, it is.
Have you had a chance to reread your statement since you made it on the 20th of January?
Yes.
Is its content true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yeah, everything is fine except from the background number 3. It said part-time. It was full-time.
Forgive me, is this paragraph 3?
Paragraph 3, yeah.
You're referring to your work for Lloyds Bank?
Yeah.
And you were in fact working full-time?
Yeah.
Is that correct? Thank you. So apart from that one correction, is the content otherwise true?
Yes.
Thank you. I'd like to begin by asking you a few questions about your background. How old are you now?
I'm 43 years old.
And you're married, is that right?
Married, yeah. Her name is Olga Kelly.
And for how long have you been married to Mrs. Kelly?
22 years coming up to.
Great. After you left school, you studied at Cardiff University, is that right?
Correct.
What was your degree in?
Computer science.
What did you do upon leaving university?
We went and took over my parents' post office because my mum had an armed robbery, so she had a breakdown from it, and she was getting losses, which at the time we thought it was to do the fact that she was an IT, so good at IT. So we did a family transfer to keep the office open for the community, because in the place there were a lot of old pensioners, there was a day centre, there was a disabled centre nearby.
Thank you. You've just explained that you took over your parents' branch.
Yeah.
If I can just ask you a few questions about that. Which branch are you referring to?
Bondegg Post Office.
And where is that located?
In Swansea, in Manchester.
Thank you. Before you took over the branch, did you assist your parents in running it?
Yes, I used to be a post office clerk.
And was that whilst you were working full-time at...
That was with working like on the weekend and working in between Lloyds and at university and things.
When did your parents acquire that branch?
They acquired in 1997, and it was paper-based at the time. And they went for the training, and I went for the training with my mum, the initial training, and then I went to a training when I took over the post office again.
And was your mother the sub-postmistress of the branch?
Yes, it was.
You've explained that your parents' branch experienced an armed robbery, is that right?
Correct, yeah.
Do you recall when that was?
I think that was 1998. And they didn't take any money because my dad fought the armed robber. They had a gun, and he was in the Navy before, and he got a medal from the post office for it. And from all that stress, it caused my mum to get sex under the Mental Health Act.
And was it at that point that you decided to take over running the branch?
Not straight away. Once we finished university and things, and my wife and I got married, they did a family transfer, because I think for about a year or so, my dad was a temporary postmaster for health reasons, and then I took over then.
Do you recall when you were appointed as the sub-postmaster of the branch?
I was appointed the 17th of January 2003.
You've described a transfer taking place.
Yeah.
Can you just explain what did you pay to purchase the branch?
The post office was, I think, roughly £140,000, but they did, because we only just got married, they did a transfer of 40,000 to my wife and I as like a wedding type gift. So then we took a £100,000 loan from the bank to purchase the rest.
Do you recall signing any documents when you were appointed as a sub-postmaster?
It was like a two or three page document, not the big 40-page contract. It's like a appointment of office, I think it was called.
Is it conditions of appointment
Yes,
you've mentioned? Is that right? That's what you mentioned in your statement. And what did that two-page document cover?
It just covered to say, like, you're the postmaster of Bondi Post Office, these are the hours you have to open, etc.
Were you required to sign any other documents?
No. Just the only bit was to sign to say this is what the account was when my parents had it, and this is the account I have now. So from that time onwards, any gains or losses are my responsibility.
How much income did you receive from the post office when you were appointed the sub-postmaster?
When I was appointed, it was about, I think, 21,000.
Did that increase subsequently?
Increase it, and it goes up to about, over the couple of years, about 30,000.
What sorts of goods and services did you provide from the branch?
At the very beginning, when we could go from my parents, we had just the post office and stationery and greeting cards. But we got rid of the greeting cards and we put like a little pet shop in there. And a bit later on, we did DVD rentals as well.
You've mentioned a pet shop.
Yeah.
Was that a successful venture?
It was successful whilst the post office was open, yeah.
Did you employ staff to help you run the branch?
We employed two staff. We employed my wife, Olga Kelly, and the second one was Caroline Butler, I think her name was.
Before we come to your experience of using Horizon, I'd like to ask you about the two armed robberies that you experienced whilst you were sub-postmaster of the branch.
Yeah.
The first was in November 2003, is that right?
Correct, yeah.
On that occasion, you've described being threatened with a gun and a rock. Is that what happened?
Yeah, rock. And they used the rock and threw it through the counter. And when it was going through the counter, I had to move my head. So I went away from the counter, so I didn't press the panic button. We went to the back and we called 999 on the phone. After about, I think, let's say £45,000 was stolen or something, the post office wrote a couple of days later and said we are liable for the whole amount because we didn't press the panic button. I spoke to Mark Baker at the time and he said that's very, very outrageous. I wrote a letter to my head of area, Wolf, that's her surname, I don't know her first name, and I wrote and said, if you come to my office, stay behind the counter, don't move 1 centimetre or I'll throw a brick at you, I'll gladly pay the £45,000. After that letter, went to see Angela, the head of area, and afterwards it was then dropped, that request for that £45,000 for the loss.
The second occasion, I think, was on the 16th of November 2004, is that right?
Correct, yeah.
On that occasion, forgive me, in relation to figures, you mentioned the November 2003,
Yeah.
you recall the sum of £47,000.
Yeah, the one is on the statement is the more correct one, yeah.
Right, because I think it was on the second occasion that you stated a sum of about £40,000 was stolen.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah.
And the police attended your branch on that occasion, is that correct?
The police and the audit people came at the same time, yeah. And they counted the stock and they confirmed that everything was, the amount was stolen and there was nothing left in the office, and they said that everything had gone, in other words.
And what action was taken by the police in relation to the theft?
On the police, they did manage to capture one person for the armed robbery. When the police asked the post office, do they want to claim the losses from the person who did the armed robbery, the post office declined, and they then tried to claim the loss from us again.
So just to be clear, the post office were asked by the police if they wished to recover the sum of approximately £47,000 from the person who'd been identified as stealing it,
Yeah,
and they said no,
yeah,
but they did come after you for the sum.
yeah. And the police used blood to find that person.
Did you pay that sum?
No, and we had an argument, and in the end it was dropped.
I'll come back to the audit of
Yeah.
your branch on that occasion, but I'd like to ask you now about training. You've mentioned already that your parents acquired the branch in 1997 and you attended some training with your mother, is that
Yeah,
correct?
correct, yeah.
Do you recall when Horizon was first installed at your parents' branch?
I think it was installed in 1999.
And is it correct that you'd already begun to assist your parents
Yeah,
in running the branch by that stage?
yeah. I was from 1997 onwards. I was always in the post office, either full time or part time, depending on the situation, like with university and things. And I was there when the Horizon was installed and when it was paper based as well.
You've explained you received a day of training, is that correct?
With my mum. in the
Initially.
hospital, yeah.
In a hotel near to your post office.
Correct, yeah.
Can you briefly describe what that training entailed?
It entailed how to use Horizon quickly, and also how to upsell, but mostly just to how to use Horizon. But it wasn't a live system; it was just a dummy terminal. I managed to pick up very, very quickly, but my mum struggled with it. She was the last one to leave that day.
Do you recall whether you or your mother received any training on the balancing of accounts?
Not on that one-day training. I know later on my mum requested a trainer to come to help her balance. And I don't know the result of that balance. Did it balance or not? I don't know.
What was your impression of the adequacy of that training that you received in?
For people who were at that time buying post office or running post office, who were not been brought up with ITs and things, I thought it lacked very good training, because like my mum, she doesn't use computers and she struggled with it, and a lot of other people were struggling from it.
When you were appointed the Subpostmaster in 2003, did you receive any further training?
Yes, we went to, at the time, it was, I don't know if it still exists, it was called Albany Road Post Office in Cardiff. Went to training there, and they also came to my office as well. And at the time, we also told the trainee some things that they were telling people to be wrong. Like, one thing was British Gas payments with a smart card, they cannot be reversed. So you had to make sure the customer's got a payment before you do the transaction. Whereas other transactions you can reverse it, those ones you can't. So if you don't get the money, then if the customer can't pay, you'll be sought because you can't reverse it.
And is this something your trainer
Did not know.
did not know,
Yeah.
but which you explained?
Yeah.
In your view, how knowledgeable was your trainer about the Horizon system?
I would say quite average. Not that good.
Did you receive any training in branch?
received like the trainer who came for one balance and saddle us, but because she felt that we knew more than her, she just didn't do much. She just watched us, really.
Did you receive any further training from the post office after your...
The only trainings we got then afterwards, we used to get these memo books every week or every couple of weeks sent in the post, and it would say, this is the new product, this is how you process it. And one thing I did tell the post office I thought was annoying, as a sub-post office, we had to open from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m, 5 days a week, whereas the Crown office always had a training time to train the staff. It was 9 till 9:30 on a Wednesday. So any new products came in, they can train their staff to how to run it, but whereas we had to do it whilst the customers were coming in and out.
If I've understood you correctly, you're saying the post office communicated changes in products to you via a weekly memo. Is that right?
Yeah.
Did you find that helpful?
I found it all right for myself, but I also think it could have been better for other people, like having a CD with a video demonstration and things like that, which they didn't do.
Did you experience problems using the Horizon system?
I did experience some losses and errors, and there were a few losses, like on foreign exchange. There was a £200 error notice, which was tracked to a customer, but it was used a debit card, and because he changed his debit card, we couldn't get the money back from post office.
What were you advised to do? Who were you to contact if you experienced problems with Horizon?
I called the helpline. Sometimes they would say contact the customer, like on that currency. Sometimes they might say contact Alliance in Leicester at the time. Or sometimes they would say, well, you're the only one with the problem on that at the beginning, and it should come and sort itself out, like in a couple of weeks' time if there's an error or whatever.
How often did you contact the helpline? Can you recall?
I would say on different occasions, different problems would be about five times a week.
I'd like to ask you about an issue you reported in January 2006
Yeah.
relating to a suspected bug in the Horizon system.
Yeah.
You've explained in your statement that you identified a bug relating to the Smart Post stamp function.
Yeah.
Can you explain what that is, please?
At the time, they were just moving from having stamps in the office to having stamps being produced on a label. So you say it creates the stock virtually. And you want me to explain the bug? Or?
Well, please, yes.
Yeah. And what the bug was, when the virtual stock gets generated, it allows it to have anything else that is on the stack to be ghosted. So it becomes two transactions. So if you had like a £200 BT bill, then the system would think there was 2 times £200 BT bill. But when you do your account and stuff, the second bill is not shown. If you did a deposit of, say, £400, then it will come up as 2 £400 deposits. If you took money out of, say, £300, it would take out £300 times 2. It doubles it.
Were you able to work out why the stamp function was causing those discrepancies?
I couldn't work out 100% what was causing it, but it was causing it to transaction, and that's the reason what made me look for all these problems was if you go back to the second robbery after the police and the audit did all my accounts, they told me I had to open the next day, if I didn't open next day, then don't bother opening at all. So once we did our count, the system came up and said we were minus £2,000 on the office. And I had a big argument with the help desk, and I said, how can I be a minus 2,000? I can't give more than what the office have. In the end, it was agreed that it would be put into suspense account, which it stayed until 2006. And that's what I've been looking.
Thank you. Coming back to the question of this bug that you suspected in the system, what did you do to try to get to the bottom of the problem?
I contacted the post office help desk, reported it. I also contacted a couple other offices that I know to see if they had the same, if they do the same step, would it cause the same problem? And they have confirmed it did. The post office then later on referred it to sort of like a third level, which was Fujitsu, who called me up. And they said, we managed to replicate the bug, we know about it. I was at the time a branch secretary for the Swansea branch, and I said, well, are you going to send a memo for you to tell people, just for example, if you're going to do a smart stamp, don't do any other transactions at the same time, just do them separately. That way the bug wouldn't get triggered. And they said, no, we won't do that, we just let it carry on. I said, well, I'll give you about 30 days notice, and if you don't say anything, I will then make it public at the Federation conference at the time.
And excuse me, could I just ask you to try and remember this conversation you were having?
Yeah.
Was it with the post office helpline, or was it with an employee or employees of Fujitsu?
It was both. I called the help desk,
Yeah.
and later on the Fujitsu helpline called up.
So you explained the existence of this bug,
Yeah.
both to post office and Fujitsu?
Yeah, and the Fujitsu person confirmed they replicated the bug
Fine.
in the internal.
Thank you.
You've explained that you told the post office that you would inform other postmasters if they didn't.
Yeah.
To your knowledge, did they inform other sub-postmasters of the existence of this bug?
No.
And just to be absolutely clear, you've explained that that you detected duplicate transactions,
Yeah.
in effect, when this smart post stamp function was being used. Is that right?
Yes.
In conjunction with a bank card payment. Is that what
You
triggered
use
it?
the bank card, it brings the bug up, so you can see it. But if you don't use the bank card, it was still relevant. It still happens. It's just you've used the bank card, it triggers the other bug that brings up the stack that you can see it happening.
So it was the fact of using the stamp function itself which was causing the duplication. Is that
Yeah.
right? To your knowledge?
Yeah.
You've mentioned that you experienced a number of shortfalls
Yeah.
when using, forgive me, apparent shortfalls when you were using the Horizon system. One of them you've dated to the 4th of January 2006.
Yeah.
And that one you say related to the gyros. Is that correct?
Correct, yeah.
Can you explain what happened on that occasion?
Well, because at the time we had DVD rentals and things, so we did open it late sometimes, and it was something about we put the gyros in about 8 o'clock at night, and it turns out something about it's a cut-off time, which they don't actually tell you that if it's not done by 7:30, it's not counted or something. But we only found out after the error notice we got told it.
And what did you do to report that discrepancy?
What do you mean by that, sorry?
Forgive me, on this occasion you said you tried to put the gyro through the system, is that
Yeah.
right? But it hadn't recorded it.
Yeah.
What then happened?
We got like an error notice saying there's a shortfall, and we had to pay it back.
And did you pay it back?
Yeah.
How did you do that?
Just put the cash in to the office.
You've set out in your statement a number of shortfalls that you experienced. You've itemised them between paragraphs 52 and 56. I don't propose to take you through each and every one, but I have a couple of questions for you, if I may. How did you keep records of the shortfalls that you experienced?
When I was getting all the documents for the High Court, because we lost our house, and my wife did keep some of the documents you could find. When I was going through all the documents, I found some of these error notices still within the files. So that's how I got those actual days and figures and submitted it onto the accounts.
When you say within the files, are you talking about electronic records or hard paper records that you'd retained? Yeah. And had you printed those off the system, or were they handwritten records you'd made yourself?
No, they were actually error notice from the post office or error notice from the Horizon, stuff like that.
And in relation to the figures you've mentioned, you've said against the vast majority of them that they were repaid in full. Yeah. How did you repay those sums?
You normally, at the beginning, you would put the money into the account, and then when you balance it, we'll put it back up. Or I think later on, it will come up on the system saying there's an error notice. Do you agree or not agree? You say yes, and then it will adjust itself, and you have to put the money in.
And were you always putting cash in, or were you having money deducted from your salary as well?
No, I never did the salary deduction, to my knowledge.
You've said in respect of many of these shortfalls that you declared them by following the post office procedure. Do you mean by that you reported them to the helpline?
They either noticed the error and they sent me an error notice for it, or I reported to the helpline, yeah.
Can you estimate how much you think you paid out to make good shortfalls shown by Horizon?
The only one I know on top of my head in total was the final one of the 13,000. Now, if you add the other ones beforehand, I can't tell you how much that is altogether. No.
You've described, we've discussed already the armed robbery that you experienced on the 16th of November 2004. I'd like to ask you a bit more about the audit that took place on the day that, I think it was, forgive me, the following day, is that correct?
No, the audit was done on the day of the robbery.
The same day?
They came, I think it was the same day, they came with the police and they saw what was stolen and they confirmed that whatever amount was stolen at the time and there was nothing left in the office.
So the purpose of that specific audit was simply to establish how much money had been taken?
Correct.
Is that right? And you've explained that a shortfall appeared the following day, is that right?
Yeah, because I had to balance that because it happened on a Tuesday and Wednesday was the day that we had to balance. So we used Wednesday to also get the door fixed. When we did the balance, the system came up that we were minus £2,000 short.
Now, when the auditor had checked how much was missing the previous day, what had the auditor then done?
He just signed the paper and there was like no money left in the office. And that's why when it came to do the audit, when it came next day to do a balance, it came up minus 2,000.
Had there been any transactions put through the system between the auditor leaving and you balancing the following day?
No, nothing. We were completely closed and they were putting the door in.
What did you do when this apparent shortfall of £2,000 arose?
I called the post office up, the help desk, and I said, I'm not accepting this £2,000 shortfall. I said, we've been closed. The day before, the post office and with the police and the audit team counted all the money and they confirmed what was stolen. Unless you're saying they cooked the money, I don't see how it could be minus £2,000 in the office. And we had a big argument. So you have to accept it if you want to open. That's why I'm not going to accept it. So in the end, it was agreed to put it into a suspense account, which it stayed until 2006.
You ran your branch for approximately 3.5 years, is that right?
Correct.
As the Subpostmaster. How many times were your accounts audited in that time?
After network reinvention started to become a thing in the network, because there was, in our area, there was Bondegg Post Office, there was Robert Street Post Office, and there was Kumbulla Post Office. And at the time, the post office wanted to close Kumbulla Post Office, which she agreed. And they wanted to close one other office, either myself or Robert Street. And then they were going to put a new office at CK Supermarket down the road. I didn't want to close because of the community. We were very close to the disabled centre and things, whereas Robert Street did want to close, but he then later on changed. After the first robbery, they came back to us and say, did you want to close now because you had the armed robbery? I said, no, I still want to stay open because I want to provide the service for the community at the time. In hindsight, I probably should have closed then, but hindsight is a good thing to have. After that, when I refused it in 2003, that's when we started to get a lot more audits. I thinking they were trying to find something to close an office down. And one audit, I think, was sometime in 2004 in the summer. He came in, and overall we were about £200 short, which we paid it back with a cheque. But he was there for like nearly all day, and he was looking for all the stock, all the accounts transaction on the phone, like he was looking for something, but he couldn't find it. So in the end, he had to go with that £200.
The final audit of your branch was on the 20th of July 2006, is that right?
Correct, yeah.
By whom was that audit conducted?
Initially, the retail line manager said that she's coming in because a customer complained about the lavender smell, saying it was putting her off having a lavender smell in the office, and the fact that we recommended sending a parcel to Russia in a certain way, which we never would have done. But said, because I'm here, I'll check. I'd do an audit. And when she did the audit, she was something like, I can't tell in my head now, I think it was £9,000 short. I did not know where that shortfall come. There was some money which I think I might have known where it came from at the time, but not a £9,000 figure. I can't remember what it was, maybe £200 or £1,000 shortfall, I would know. She said that, well, we're going to now have to close your office. And she called for an audit team to come down. There's one guy who'd been coming now for the last 3 years. It's the same audit person. When he did the audit, he found about £13,000 short. So he's gone up from £9,000 up to £13,000. At the time, the retail line manager said that if you resign your position, then we won't prosecute you for false accounting and theft. So I just in the end said, okay, I'm resigning. And I called Keith Richards, about what was going on. And he said, well, because you resign now, you're on your own. I called him up.
So who's Keith Richards, please?
He was the Welsh Executive Officer.
of the Federation.
Yeah, Federation. I called Mark Baker, and Mark Baker said, well, you haven't been paid your grant, so that's offsetting as well. And also, he advised to get a solicitor. Don't go with the Federation or go by yourself. So we got a solicitor.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. Just coming back, you've mentioned that you resigned.
Yeah.
Were you suspended before you took the decision to resign from your position as a sub-postmaster?
Yeah, sorry, I was suspended then. It was later on I resigned, sorry, yeah.
Do you recall when you were suspended?
I was suspended on that day. It was later on I resigned.
Is that the date of the audit?
Yeah,
And forgive me, you've just explained you were advised by Mr. Baker
Yeah.
to obtain a legal representative, is that right?
correct, yeah,
And that was in connection with the criminal investigation.
correct.
You've explained that in your statement you were invited to attend an interview under caution.
Yeah,
Was that in connection with the alleged shortfall that was found in July 2006?
correct, yes.
Who invited you to attend your interview under caution?
The first time the post office interviewed me, and they wanted to interview me when I was under the Mental Health Act, and the solicitor said, no, that's unacceptable, because I completely, during the interview, completely comatized, couldn't remember, I just could not answer anything.
Forgive
I
me.
can't remember that part much. Yeah.
No, that I quite understand. You've just mentioned that you were detained under the Mental Health Act. Is that correct?
Yeah.
When did that happen?
After when I got suspended, the GP gave me tablets and stuff. And when I went then to the post office, wanted to interview me, I had started to have an interview, and I just completely blanked out. What I'd been told by people at the time, I could not respond to names or anything. And the post said, oh, that's fine, we can still carry on. The solicitor said, no, he can't, he's not fit to be interviewed. And
So you had a solicitor with you
Yeah.
on that first occasion that you
Yeah.
attended for interview.
I think, yeah,
Is that right? With, I think you said it was post office investigators. Is that correct?
yeah.
And do you recall where that interview took place?
The first one I don't remember, but the second one was at the police station.
And it was during the course of that interview that you experienced a breakdown in your mental health. Is that
On the
right?
first one, I had
The
a
first
breakdown.
interview, forgive me.
Yeah, but the second one I do remember was at the police station. That one I do remember. The second one I remember more than the first one.
For how long did you receive treatment?
Well, I had treatment longer than that, but the doctor said I was well enough to be interviewed under caution about 6 months later, and that's then dead at the police station.
Do you recall for how long you were detained in hospital? You were detained in hospital, isn't
No,
that right?
I was outside.
No, forgive
but,
me. You were,
Yeah,
sorry,
Yeah.
please do carry on.
yeah. I was in the house, but the doctor had like control of my medication, finance, and things.
Right. Had you had any problems with your mental health before these events occurred?
No.
What do you believe was the trigger for these events?
The fact that the post office was all the losses, the stress from it, trying to find it all, and no one would listen, and how they conducted themselves afterwards with all the threats. Like on the second the second interview, when the solicitor said that we would use the bug that he found as part of the defence, and the post office then sort of left it, but just before we left, they said, "Oh, we might go for your wife," and that completely phased me then, and I panic again. And I said, I'll plead if you want, because at the time my wife was on a visa for UK.
Just to break that down a little bit, Mr. Kelly, I think you've explained that after you were under the care of your GP for 6 months.
Yeah.
Is that right? And he said you were fit to be interviewed again.
Yeah.
You attended a second interview.
Yeah. And they knew why I couldn't do the interview the first time. They knew it was because of my anxiety and panic and PTSD from the doctor.
And on the second occasion, you were represented again by a lawyer, is that right?
The same one, yeah.
And what advice did your lawyer give you precisely as to how you were to defend yourself against?
They said just plead not
charges?
guilty, and we would use, if they want to proceed it to court, they would use the bug that I discovered as a part of the defence to against the why the figure was £13,000.
When you referred to the bug, you're talking about the stamp post,
Yeah.
the smart post stamp function, is that
Correct.
right? Which you'd raised back in January 2006.
Correct.
What evidence did you have to show that this had occurred and that you'd raised concerns about it?
I got those screenshots and I called them up. If you're talking about do I have any call references, I do have, but I don't know where they are now. But I did call them up at the time.
And
Mr. Kelly, I'm not as familiar with jargon about computers as some people.
Yeah.
When you say you had screenshots, could you tell me what you've done to get those?
Well, I did every single step,
Yeah.
and I took a screenshot.
So a photograph with your mobile phone or something, is that
Yeah.
what you're talking about? Yeah, fine.
And it showed at the very end the double transaction.
Yeah, so you had a sort of photographic record
Yeah.
of what you discovered in relation to Horizon, is that
Correct. It's a physical, you can see the step-by-step the bug game produced.
Yeah, fine, thanks. Just wanted to make sure I had it right.
Yeah.
All right.
in terms of timings, I know it's difficult to recall precise dates, but we know that your audit occurred on the 20th of July 2006.
Yeah.
So this second interview would have been approximately 6 months later.
Correct.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Roughly.
Yeah.
Around then. And you'd retained these screenshots that you'd taken, is that right?
Correct.
What had you done with those?
I gave it to my solicitor, who used that as part of the defence.
During the course of your interview?
Correct.
Right.
And
so
she sold the screenshot to those people, because what they initially said to her was, how are you going to prove this bug exists? Because he said she knew about this bug, and then she dropped those screenshots, and they were surprised, and then that's when it practically terminated.
You've mentioned already your first interview was carried out by post office investigators.
Yeah.
Who conducted your second interview?
The same people, the same two men. I don't.
And you've explained when shown that evidence, the post office didn't take any further action against you, is that right?
They didn't take any further action, but they also did not say they were not going to proceed anymore. So for years later, I just felt like if I, firstly because of the Secrets Act, that if I did make it more public, they would go after me. And also at the time I wasn't well enough. It's only 2010 I started to become more well, and that's when I discovered about all the other people getting affected with Horizon and people committing suicide. Person, Samira, who went to prison pregnant, and I started to feel guilty by all that, and I felt I was partly to blame for it all.
You've mentioned already that your wife assisted you in running the branch.
Correct.
Did she herself come under suspicion with the post office in relation to the shortfall of circa £13,000?
She didn't come. She wasn't suspected of it until my solicitor presented that bug, the screenshot, and then they said at the end, well, we might then prosecute your wife if you don't plead guilty. And that completely flipped me up then.
And you recall this being after you produced the evidence of the
Correct.
bug?
Yeah. And the solicitor said then, I'll sort it out with them after I left.
You've told us already that you ultimately chose to resign
Yeah.
your office as a sub-postmaster.
I resigned on that day, on that second interview, permanently, yeah.
What led you to that decision?
It was too stressful. I couldn't handle it anymore. I couldn't do anything. I couldn't think of anything, and I knew I wouldn't be able to run it anymore. Even they said to me, you can have the office back. I wouldn't be able to run it then. I was too gone.
What had you originally hoped to do with your post office business and your retail businesses?
Well, we were originally hoping to keep the office going. The pet shop would carry on, and that was expanding at the time. And we would start a family. It was a 3-bedroom house. No, sorry, 4. It was 4. It's a 4-bedroom house, which would have been enough to have a family. But after the breakdown and things like that, and we lost the house from it all, we thought we couldn't have a family because we had no house, no stability. And the reason we lost the house was the bank, NatWest, they had on the business loan, it had to be a post office. And because the post office got closed, they would not take any money to pay the loan, and they recalled it instead. And they would not give the lease, the deed to Lloyd's for it to be remortgaged, so it got repossessed in the end.
And that left you without a home?
Correct.
Is that right?
Yeah.
In terms of your original investment in the business, you've explained you were gifted £45,000 by your parents.
Correct.
Which you used as equity to fund the purchase of the premises.
It counted as a deposit for the loan, yeah.
Forgive me, and you'd taken the loan of approximately £100,000.
Correct, yeah.
In relation to the business.
Yeah.
You've mentioned that the house was repossessed. What then happened to the property?
It was sold at auction for about, I think, £85,000.
And how were the proceeds of sale administered?
It was just sold, and NatWest kept the money for the business loan, that was it. And the £13,000 shortfall, the poacher said that I was liable for, you could say was offset against the grant they haven't paid yet, because we were supposed to have about £13,000 grant under the network reinvention, because we haven't been paid for it yet. So it cancelled each other out.
So were you allowed to offset those sums?
Yeah.
Right, and that was for an alleged shortfall shown by Horizon?
When I got interviewed, there was a £13,000 shortfall, and I was there was a £13,000 outstanding grant. The poacher haven't paid me, so it cancelled each other out.
And was the grant the matter that Mark Baker had raised? I think you mentioned that Mark Baker had alerted you to the fact that you would be entitled to a grant under the Network Transformation Programme. What is the current state of your finances, Mr. Kelly?
Well, everything is in my wife's name. She's got the shop because I can't really now run a business. I don't trust myself to do it all. I helped my wife in the shop until this COVID all started. And I also help with my mum. I do the care because she's now got she can't remember things at all, and she can't move much, so I have to be her carer.
And you've explained you're caring for your mum. Were you able to find alternative employment when your appointment as a Subpostmaster ended?
No, because I didn't. Because one thing is, I had all that mental illness. I couldn't trust myself. I thought to do things, and also I felt if I contacted the post office for like a reference, whatever, they might say, oh, firstly, they probably wouldn't give a good reference if they would, but also they might have said, oh, we forgot to prosecute him or something. So I just I didn't do anything. just helping my wife, I did, in her business.
You've told us already what impact the first interview had on your mental health. Can you describe how you felt at the time, psychologically, to be experiencing repeated shortfalls in your accounts shown by the Horizon system?
I got very, very stressed, especially sometime when the office was not that busy and he still had some big shortfall. And anxious, and it was quite irritating to call the helpline, and you have to wait like until next day for information, which it doesn't always help.
We know that as a result of your first interview, you were placed under the care of your GP.
Yeah.
How did you feel when you were invited to attend a second interview by the post office under caution?
Very, very anxious, especially because it was at the police station, and nervous. But something that had to be done.
What's been the longer term effect of these events upon your health and your well-being?
Well, I'm very, very anxious now, and I get stressed quite easily, and I got PTSD, and I quite often blame myself. I keep on thinking that I caused some of these problems for a lot of people. The fact that I didn't publish the bug when I could have. I've become quite suicidal, and a couple of times I did try to do it. Yeah.
You've mentioned your wife Olga and your aspirations, your previous aspirations to have a family.
Yeah.
How has she been affected?
She's been more. She's been a bit stressed, and she's been a bit reclusive. But she is stronger than me, and yeah, we're going back to the bit you. I lost track on that bit now. Never mind.
That's okay. I was asking you about Olga, your wife.
Yeah, no. She thinks we should just like carry on, but it's me who can't. Like, it was her who told me to go to the High Court, join the group, which I agree with, because I was thinking, could I cope with it, opening up all rooms and stuff.
But she encouraged you
Yeah,
to join the group litigation.
correct.
What effect did the audit and the criminal investigation have upon your standing in your local community?
There was a lot of rumours going around because we wasn't put on the papers, but a lot of people thought, oh, we must have been involved in the armed robbery, and that's why we'd been closed, because they found out that we cooked the money from the office and things, and that's what affected the pet shop as well then, because people would not come in.
You've explained you participated as a claimant in the group litigation.
Correct, yeah.
How much did you receive by way of compensation?
I think in total about 28,000. I think it was like 19,000. No, I think 20,000 for the first payment and 8,000 for the second one, something like that.
Did this amount cover the losses and the harm that you suffered?
No, didn't cover the house, nothing.
How do you feel now about the treatment that you received from the post office?
Not good. I actually think the post office were doing this to try to close offices down and not pay compensation. They were looking at ways to close them down, because the other thing was what I found out in the High Court, because I've always been wondering how my office got a £13,000 shortfall. And what came up in the High Court was they can do remote access. So it made me think that they went into my account to put a shortfall in there, so I would not be a postmaster to go to the Federation conference with those screenshots to make everyone in the conference aware of that bug at the time.
What do you think the post office needs to do now to put right what happened to you and other sub-postmasters?
Firstly, they need to pay the full, not exclude the 555 from the compensation, even though I agree, as myself, this is, that if we carried on fighting, it would have dragged on for like another 3 years, and people with convictions would have been waiting for another 3 years. They're still punishing the 555, that we're not getting our full compensation. They keep on saying it's full and final. They also, I think, will need to send like a referral letter that we can give to people if they want to work, whatever, to say the reason why they've not been working for 10 years, 5 years, whatever, is because of what we did to them. And an apology, a sincere apology in the papers, and better training for other postmasters in the future.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. I've no further questions I wish to ask you.
Yeah.
Is there anything you'd like to say which we've not covered?
Yeah. Two things which I'd like to say was, the first one is I think the law of the should be activated. It was discussed on the Hillsborough inquiry, the Hillsborough law, because, and there's two, I can't remember what they call it. One was the candid, where the public people have to state the truth all the time. They can't give false information, and they have to give information if required. And the second one was the fact that there is a limit of what they can use to prosecute people. So, for argument's sake, a postmaster legal cover is normally like £50,000. So that'd be like the legal budget the post office can use to take the person to court, not use millions of pounds to prosecute someone or in a civil case. And the second one, which I think caused a lot of this problem, was the fact that the law was changed in 1999 under the PACE 1984, where the computer evidence became an absolute proof in courts unless someone can prove that the system was bossed at the time of the errors. And I can see if that law is not changed somehow, I can't say how it needs to be changed, as we get more and more into computers, that there'll be more scandals coming up with NHS medical records or banks and things.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. So have you got
Thank you very much, Mr. Kelly. Yeah. Thank you for coming to give your evidence in such a clear and forthright manner. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir. That concludes our evidence for this afternoon.
Right. Well, I'm sorry that I'm now going to cause a delay in proceedings, but as I said, I have to take an engagement which has been long-standing for a little while. But hopefully by about 3:40 or 3:45, we can do some more reading of summaries, if that's acceptable to everyone. I can't see Miss Patrick. Yes, I can see Miss Patrick. Is that all right, Miss Patrick?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
If I finish my engagement more quickly, I'll let everyone know, but assume it'll be about 3:40. Thank you very much. Whenever you're ready, Ms. Patrick.
Thank you, sir. We're starting with a summary of the evidence of Miss Karina Price. Miss Karina Price was appointed sub-postmistress of Sopley Post Office in Dorset in 1999. She was married with 2 then young sons. She bought the business because it fitted well for her and her family's needs. The post office was in a rural area and they lived in a 4-bedroom house next door, which had a garden for the boys to play in. Miss Price first received error notices on the Horizon system from 2002 to 2003. From then on, she noticed that the figures were regularly wrong and just wouldn't balance. She would, she says, pull her hair out, not being able to understand why. At first, she thought it was her making the mistakes, and she therefore paid for these initial shortfalls. She estimates that out of her own pocket, she put in £13,000. She phoned the help desk about these discrepancies, to which they always said, "It'll bounce back," which she found very frustrating and unhelpful. An auditor visited, and Miss Price recalls them saying that she can't just leave £2,000 in the suspense account. She was told to take that money and keep it herself. Miss Price said she couldn't do that as it was post office money. Miss Price had various other audits before the audit in 2005, which led to her suspension. Until this audit in 2005, she'd paid any shortfall as was shown by Horizon, but can't recall the amount of discrepancies at this stage as it was such a long time ago. Miss Price recalls, "I would spend until the early hours trying to figure it out, and in the end I just had to accept the figures and sign it off." An unannounced audit was carried out by the Post Office in 2005, and a shortfall of £13,000 was found. In 2006, she was charged with numerous counts of suppressing a valuable security and 3 counts of theft. As the case proceeded to court, her barrister informed her that the shortfalls were in excess of £17,000. She was advised to pay it before court, but she realised that the loan she took out didn't cover the shortfalls in addition to her living expenses and her mortgage. She says, "I had to take a loan out of £37,784 to cover the shortfall, my living expenses and mortgage, believing that I would be able to work and then repay it." She adds, "The whole situation caused me a huge amount of stress. It made me feel awful and very upset." The Post Office told her barrister that if she pled guilty, she probably wouldn't get a custodial sentence, but she wasn't willing to plead to something she didn't do. She pleaded not guilty. Miss Price was summoned to the Crown Court at Bournemouth on 30th of November 2005 after her conviction following trial. She was completely devastated and broke down in tears. Her whole world, she says, had fallen apart. She never returned to Sopley because she thought her family would be better off without her. She was depressed and had suicidal thoughts. She lost her home, her shop, and her husband. Miss Price says, "I felt like I wanted to jump under a lorry." She visited her GP, who was aware of her conviction, and she says treated her awfully, to the point where she felt she couldn't go back for treatment. Miss Price was sentenced on 19th January 2006 to a suspended prison sentence. Her conviction was quashed in July 2021. Miss Price says she had always been the breadwinner of their family. Her physical health deteriorated and she struggled to cope. She was forced to take out a further loan of £20,000 due to financial pressure put on her to pay the post office. Miss Price says, "I hated being in debt, but I had no choice. It was not a comfortable feeling at all. I worried about how I would pay the mortgage. At first, she says she missed a lot of repayments and the interest kept getting higher and higher. She had sleepless nights because she thought they were going to lose the house. Miss Price is still paying those loans back today. And she feels, she says, like I have spent my whole life living with a huge debt hanging over my head." Miss Price says once She had a good relationship with the people in her village. However, they read the articles published around the time of her conviction and decided not to believe her. One local article suggested she had stolen from vulnerable people. Miss Price left Stopley a few months before her trial and separated from her husband. This involved leaving her sons behind with their father. She hasn't seen her eldest son for quite a while. He doesn't speak with her because she walked away. She has 2 grandchildren who she's never met. Despite trying to reach out, she thinks they do not want anything to do with her. Miss Price keeps in touch with her youngest son, and she enjoys playing games with him once a week. She says she has to live with the stigma and consequences of the conviction which has blighted her life and the lives of her immediate family. She wants to say to the inquiry, not a day passes when she doesn't think about it. We move next to the summary of the evidence of Mr. David Thomas Hedges. Once Tom Hedges' children had reached secondary school age, he and his wife looked for a change of lifestyle. After 4 or 5 months of looking, he was offered the opportunity to buy Hogsthorpe Post Office. Mr. Hedges became Subpostmaster of the branch. He says it had been drilled into him from the very start that he would be held responsible for any financial loss in the branch. He simply did not have the money to pay repeated shortfalls. He made 3 separate arrangements to pay around £2,000 each time to the post office by instalments. It always seemed strange to him, he says, that all the post office seemed to be worried about was getting the money, not why it had supposedly gone missing. Between 2003 and 2007, the post office, he says, had always dealt with losses in that way. At the beginning of 2009, a large shortfall of £10,000 occurred. Around this time, he borrowed £20,000 to put into the branch. It was, he says, becoming a money pit. On 5th of May 2010, the auditors visited his branch. A discrepancy of approximately £23,000 was found, and he was immediately suspended. Following Mr. Hedges' interview under caution, his contract was terminated on 14th June 2010, and he was charged with theft and 3 counts of false accounting. Mr. Hedges pleaded guilty as he said he felt he had no option. He was terrified he would end up in prison. The criminal solicitor appointed to represent him advised that if he agreed to plead guilty and was able to provide satisfactory character references, then his solicitor told him, Mr. Hedges recalls, that he was 95% certain that he would receive a suspended sentence rather than a custodial one. Mr. Hedges recalls the post office was seeking a 4-year custodial sentence. He was subsequently sentenced on 4th February 2011 at Lincoln Crown Court, and he was sentenced to 7 months imprisonment suspended for 18 months, together with 120 hours of unpaid work and costs of £1,000. A few days after Mr. Hedges was sentenced, his older daughter had to go to someone's house and listen to the owners there going on about the terrible man at the post office, not knowing that she was his daughter. She suffered 30 minutes of diatribe and vitriol until she got outside, sat in her car, and cried for 30 minutes. Recently, Mr. Hedges recalls he came home from a shopping trip to find his wife in a confused state. She was so confused that she called him her previous husband's name. Mr. Hedges' initial thought was that she'd had a stroke, but on taking her to the hospital, it turned out this was not the case. The doctor seemed to think she had suffered some form of mental episode. Mr. Hedges told the doctors about the deep trauma both of them had endured with regard to the post office and his conviction. They both needed to be very strong to get through all the upset and worry, and possibly, now that they believe that they are in calmer waters, Mr. Hedges believes his wife may have allowed her mind to relax, and perhaps it had gone too far. He says she appears to be getting better, but has no memory of about 5 or 6 hours on that Monday. She's now received a formal diagnosis and has been diagnosed with transient global amnesia. This condition can be brought on by stress, even through events which occurred many years ago and which have now eased. Mr. Hedges described the mental toll which followed the audit in 2010 as crippling. He wants to say to the inquiry that he believes that all of those impacted by Horizon have in common that the experience has left them scarred for life. So we're going to move now to the summary of the evidence of Miss Della Robinson. Della Robinson was sub-postmistress at the Dukenfield Post Office from 27th January 2006 to 27th February 2012 when her contract was terminated. She and her partner had bought the premises and the post office. She says she was given very basic training, which she felt was mostly inadequate or irrelevant. At first, Miss Robinson noticed some mistakes occurring for small amounts of money, usually £10 or £20. She became confident and challenged these figures as wrong. She would ring the helpline about twice a week for the first 3 years, and she says they were pleasant but not effective. Miss Robinson can recall one time when she returned from holiday to find that there was a shortfall of £36,000. After investigating it fully, it transpired that the shortfall was only £500. In 2010, they experienced a further shortfall of around £1,500, which she couldn't sort out, and Miss Robinson came to an agreement with the post office that she would pay this back at £500 per month out of her salary, her wage, even though it was not her fault. She found this very frustrating, and it made her quite angry. On the 24th of January 2012, Miss Robinson was visited by an auditor. She was sick at the time, and so she was not working, but she received a call to go to the shop, and to her amazement, it was closed. She describes it as complete chaos. The auditor from the post office informed her that they had been counting cash and had calculated a shortfall of £15,500. Miss Robinson recounted it all, and the shortfall had risen to £17,000. She was suspended straight away and was not allowed back into the post office from that point. She felt as though her world had been turned upside down. The whole experience was awful. She was interviewed on 9th February 2012. She received a letter from the post office dated 27th February 2012 confirming they would terminate her contract. She was charged with false accounting and theft in a sum in the region of £17,000, and she was initially sent to Ashton Magistrates Court after receiving a summons. At court, she was told that if she pleaded guilty to false accounting, then they would drop the theft charges. Miss Robinson then went to a plea hearing, again at Ashton Magistrates, when she was advised by her barrister to fight the case at the Crown Court. She remembers she was told by the post office that if she pleaded guilty to false accounting, they would not pursue her for the money and would drop the theft charge. Miss Robinson then chose to do this. On 12th December 2012, she pleaded guilty to false accounting. On 18th January 2013, she attended Manchester Crown Court for sentencing. She remembers the solicitors and barristers all spoke amongst themselves, and then she was sentenced to 180 hours of community service. She also had to pay £5,000 in legal costs. On 23rd of April 2021, Miss Robinson's conviction was overturned by the Court of Appeal. Miss Robinson says the stress of the whole experience exacerbated her pre-existing epilepsy. She's now registered disabled, and this has resulted in her losing her driving licence. Miss Robinson says she would suffer with nightmares where she relived the experience. She says she put on large amounts of weight, she lost her confidence, her independence, and she's developed depression. She says she was able to manage her epilepsy before this. To go from the post office being something she believed was giving her confidence back and a new lease of life, and then to have it all taken away from her was, she says, heartbreaking. She feels now she can't move forward. She says she has suffered from financial hardship as a result of the post office's actions and also suffered from a health perspective. She has been diagnosed with prolonged duress stress disorder. She has been recommended to have 20 sessions of psychological therapy, which she is currently undergoing. She feels that it isn't just her who's been affected by her conviction. Miss Robinson's son, she says, became more introverted. He was worried what people thought. She felt more for what her husband had lost. She says he'd put their whole life into them. It was his babies. He had done everything towards achieving this. Following her conviction, they had a rental property repossessed. They now have a mortgage. They're in arrears and living week by week. When they found a buyer for the post office said no, and this fell through. It has devastated her to see that her husband's efforts had all been for nothing. And we move next to the summary of the evidence of Mrs. Alison Henderson. Miss Alison Henderson was Subpostmaster at the Worsted Post Office from 1997 until the 23rd of February 2010, when she resigned. In the early 2000s, the Horizon software was introduced to her post office. For several years, she had difficulty in using the Horizon system and often struggled to balance the accounts it showed. She spoke to the helpline and the area manager to seek guidance. From 2006, onward balances were regularly wrong. The first time that Mrs. Henderson ever saw an error notice on the Horizon system was in 2006. The system generated a shortfall of £1,500, and the post office required her to pay that shortfall. However, a while later, the system generated another loss of £2,000. The shortfalls kept coming, and Mrs. Henderson could not afford to cover the amount. On 10th February 2010, 2 auditors attended Mrs. Henderson's post office. She was hopeful that they would be able to sort out any balancing difficulties. She was shocked when they advised her that there was a shortfall of £18,000. They then returned to her a couple of hours later to say that amount had reduced to £11,957.78. Mrs. Henderson was told that she could not reopen the post office and that she would be suspended. On the 22nd of February 2010, Mrs. Henderson received a letter stating that they were considering terminating her contract. She spoke to her local representative at the National Federation of Subpostmasters, and on his advice, she decided she had no option other than to resign, which she did on 23rd of February 2010. This is a decision which Mrs. Henderson says she has since regretted. She was summoned to a meeting with the post office. She was allowed to bring her Federation rep, but he was not allowed to speak during the interview. The two men conducting the interview are described by Mrs. Henderson as total bullies. Mrs. Henderson was under the impression that the purpose of the meeting was to discover where she or the system had gone wrong. But all they did, she says, was accuse her of theft. She recalls they marched her to the car park to take a look at her cheap Proton car to see if it was worthy of being a recovery asset. She was subsequently charged with theft and false accounting. Criminal proceedings were brought against her, and her case was transferred from the Magistrates' Court to Norwich Crown Court. She recalls she had never felt so scared and alone in her life. Her solicitor and barrister provided her with legal advice and advised her to take a plea bargain of false accounting, with the post office dropping the theft charge. Mrs. Henderson felt pressurised into accepting this. She says she could not face going to prison for something that I had not done, and she was desperate to avoid spending any time in prison whatsoever. She therefore, very reluctantly, accepted a plea bargain. With the prospect of a custodial sentence hanging over Mrs. Henderson, she says she felt she had no choice. As part of the plea bargain, she recalls she was told not to mention to the court anything about the Horizon system. She recalls she questioned this, she queried it as unfair with her barrister, and he says that's the way it works. The judge adjourned the hearing and ordered her to pay the alleged shortfall before the case returned to court for sentencing. Mrs. Henderson returned for sentencing on the 15th of December 2010 and was given 200 hours of community service and ordered to pay court costs of £1,400. She also paid her own lawyer's fees, which totalled £7,000. Mrs. Henderson felt so ashamed and embarrassed about past events, when I have always known that I have done nothing wrong. The mental anguish, she says, has taken its toll on her and still does. She says, being accused of something that you have not done is always a horrible feeling, but for it to result in a criminal conviction, the loss of my job and livelihood is something that I think I will never be able to get over. Mrs. Henderson says she did not attend her GP about how she was feeling at that time, that it was all being investigated as she still lived in the village too. She just tried to keep it to herself and not talk about it. She thinks now she should have obtained some professional help, and she still needs some professional assistance with the feelings which she has had from when the problems with Horizon started and which still continue today. The whole affair, she says, has had a detrimental effect on her health and on her family. She has felt very low in mood, she breaks down in tears, and she still lacks confidence. She's completed a course of CBT treatment, which she's found helpful, but she wants to say to the inquiry that she feels that this is something that will never fully leave her. Before this whole affair, she says she was regarded as a pillar of society and got heavily involved in the community. Mrs. Henderson's husband, she says, had to give up his position as chairman of the parish council to protect the integrity of the council. They moved out of the area in 2016, which resulted in them losing contact with a lot of their friends. However, this was a move that they felt they simply had to make. Their friends and neighbours in their new area knew nothing of the post office saga until after Mrs. Henderson's conviction was quashed at the Court of Appeal on 23rd April 2021. She says it was a saga in her life she wanted to shut away from people. Mrs. Henderson and her husband, she says, had kept everything from their grandchildren until her conviction was quashed. They were doing this to protect them and to avoid any stigma being passed on to them. She says, speaking about what happened to her still upsets her and reduces her to tears, as it does her grandchildren when they speak of these events. We move next to the summary of the evidence of Hashmukh Shingadia. Mr. Shingadia and his wife got married in 1996. He took over the Upper Bucklebury post office on 27th October 1998. He remembers having to submit a business plan to the post office, and he had to apply for a loan to buy the shop. The post office had a flat upstairs, which was one of the reasons why Mr. Shingadia chose that business. He thinks he and his wife paid around £57,000, and they took a commercial loan out of £40,000. They paid £17,000 themselves and then £7,000 for stock, plus legal costs. He says his problems usually arose on a Wednesday after balancing. Initially, he didn't have any idea what these losses might be attributed to. If there was a small shortfall, for example, a couple of pounds, he would put the money into the system or take it out if the system was over or under. But when the discrepancies began to get larger, Mr. Shingadia contacted the helpline. They would take him through the process and tell him the money would turn up the next week. He remembers receiving error notices on the system in 2009 or 2010. He didn't speak to the managers because he says it was hard to get through to them. He did have a Federation representative in Farnham, but he says every time he called him, he was out in India. He says this was very annoying, but also meant, he says, he had no support. Mr. Shingadia had an unannounced audit on the 26th of March 2010 when 2 auditors arrived at his post office. Due to the problems with the system, he was aware at this stage that the discrepancies were around £16,000. On the 11th May 2010, he was interviewed at Newbury Sorting Office and then charged with theft and false accounting. Mr. Shingadia could not pay the large shortfall discovered on the audit, and he had to borrow from his brother and his wife's sister. He thought that if he repaid the money, that would be the end of the matter. Mr. Shingadia was told that he could receive a custodial sentence, so on the advice of his barrister, he pleaded guilty to false accounting. He pleaded guilty to a single count of false accounting on 21st July 2011 at Oxford Crown Court. He was sentenced to 8 months imprisonment, suspended for 12 months, and ordered to carry out 200 hours of unpaid work. He paid the court costs of £2,269.69 and the legal fees of solicitors and barristers. Mr. Shingadia says he was very stressed, anxious, and worried, and my mental health began to suffer. His wife also worked full-time at the shop, and her income was affected too. He worried who would look after his wife and his family if he were in prison. He knew the impact on his wife and daughters would be massive. He says his wife is severely dyslexic, and he didn't want her to be stuck without him and 2 young daughters to look after. He says he could not sleep at night. He could not eat, and he felt worthless and hopeless. One time, he says, he went to the local graveyard and contemplated taking his own life. He says he felt there was no point in going on, and he considered ways to end his life. In 2007, they bought a house in Leicester so that they could move there on retirement to be nearer to relatives. This was repossessed when Mr. Shingadia could not keep up the mortgage payments. He says this was both embarrassing, but also upsetting, as this was intended for his retirement. His conviction also very much had an effect on the village. At first, the post office closed while he was suspended. He felt a duty to the village, as there had been a post office in that village for 100 years. They had approached the landlord in 2008 and asked if he would sell the freehold property to them, and in 2009 they started negotiations. When they lost the post office after his conviction, they lost the freehold. The landlord gave them 3 months' notice to vacate. Mr. Shingadia pleaded with him, and eventually he agreed to let them stay. Following his conviction, Mr. Shingadia resigned from the position of magistrate at the local court, and as well his position as a Freemason. 4 years ago, Mr. Shingadia had major surgery for trigeminal neuralgia. Prior to that, he was struggling because of severe pain on the right side of his head and face and an inability to eat. He believes this was caused or contributed to by the situation he found himself in. He has some links to Kate Middleton's family, who lived in the village. When the media discovered that, and they were able to link that and his conviction to the area, Mr. Shingadia and his family were also further bullied because they had attended the royal wedding in 2011. His younger daughter, who was around 12 years old at the time, got picked on and called racist names on her way to and from school. She was bullied by other children. They would say things along the lines of, "Your dad is a packy thief." The Court of Appeal quashed Mr. Shingadia's conviction on 19th July 2021. He called his wife over and they all burst into tears. Although his conviction has now been quashed, nothing can undo what he's been through or the impact which it has had on him and his family. He wants the inquiry to know he still suffers from the trauma of what has happened and that it has had a significant impact on his mental health and emotional well-being. It has also affected his wife's mental health. And when his conviction was quashed, and it was all in the media again, this brought everything back to her. Mr. Shingadia wants to say that he is so grateful to his wife for standing by him. His mental health problems began when he was accused of dishonesty, and he says they continue to this day. Mr. Shingadia started treatment on the 25th of November 2021, and he says until it has been completed and he recovers, he feels the whole thing is still hanging over me. He believes the post office knew from day one that there was a problem with the system, and he wants to say to the inquiry, what is sad is that management sat and watched innocent people going to prison, losing their livelihoods and losing their loved ones, and did nothing. We move next to the summary of the evidence of Mr. David Yates. Mr. David Yates began working as a counter clerk at the Walton-on-Thames branch of the post office in 1979. He progressed to branch manager. When the post office decided to close the branch as a Crown office, he was offered the job of Subpostmaster in 1993. Horizon was installed, and about 6 to 7 months later, he experienced shortfalls. Initially, he repaid these himself. He had paid out, he says, around £6,000 to the post office by March 2003. In March 2003, the post office carried out an audit. The auditors told Mr. Yates there was a shortfall of £366,788.67. He told the auditors they would find a shortfall accumulated over years due to the system. He was told no one else was having problems with their system. Mr. Yates was suspended the day after the investigation from his job as a sub-postmaster. In May 2003, he received a summons to attend Staines Magistrates Court. He was charged with theft, false accounting, and breach of trust. Following legal advice, Mr. Yates pleaded guilty to all the charges. He was told he could face 5 to 8 years in prison if he was found guilty at trial. Mr. Yates says he was petrified. To hopefully receive a more lenient sentence, he pleaded guilty. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison. On hearing the sentence, Mr. Yates remembers it as a blur. His wife collapsed and his family were very upset. He commenced his sentence on 31st October 2003 and remained imprisoned until December 2004. Whilst he was in prison, the post office wrote to say they would be taking, he says, they would be taking our home to pay for the shortfalls at the branch. His wife opened that letter. A proceeds of crime application incurred further legal fees. Upon his release, Mr. Yates was given an electronic tag, which was not removed until April 2005. Mr. Yates's conviction was not overturned until April 2021. Mr. Yates's mortgage payment following his conviction increased from £350 per month to approximately £700 per month. His house insurance premium also increased. On sentencing, Mr. Yates recalls being taken in the van to Highdown Prison in Surrey, which is a Category B prison. He says he was locked in a cell with 2 other men for 22 hours a day. He recalls he witnessed various violent incidents between prisoners. He was only supposed to spend a few weeks in this high security prison. However, because of difficulties with his transfer, he spent 3 months at Highdown. In the last few weeks before his transfer, he was moved to a single cell where we spent Christmas and New Year. In January 2004, Mr. Yates was transferred to an open prison on the Isle of Sheppey. By October 2004, he was informed that he would be released over the following few months. He says, following his conviction, Mr. Yates says his parents had to endure significant and sustained ill will from the local community, and he didn't think that was fair. He says his health has suffered immensely. He collapsed in 2013 and was taken to hospital because he was working too much. He wants the inquiry to know that the overturning of his conviction has had a huge impact on his mental health. He became very anxious and suffered with panic attacks. He lost weight, his mood was low, and he felt depressed. He had several episodes in relation to his heart and acute breathlessness. He's lost interest in food and in life in general. He's been told he developed an acute decompensation in his mental health at the time of the appeal court hearing in April 2021. At the time, he was suffering adjustment disorder with mixed anxiety and depressed mood. Since, he has begun to feel much more positive, and his mental health issues have begun to subside. He wants to tell the inquiry that the whole situation has been very hard on him and his family. Before his conviction, he was heavily involved in his children's rugby and netball teams. Afterwards, he had to stand on the sidelines. He was a pillar of the community before this happened. Now he says people avoid talking to him in the street. He says it breaks his heart. Finally, he would like the inquiry to know that he is deeply saddened that his parents passed away before his conviction was overturned. Move now, Chair, to the summary of the evidence of Mr. Vippin Patel, and that's his full name, Mr. Vippin Chandra Patel. He's known as Vippin, so I'm going to use that in reading the summary of his evidence. Vippin Patel is of Gujarati Indian heritage. He was born in Uganda and lived there until his family moved to the UK when he was 18 as a result of the political situation in Uganda. He has been married for 35 years and has 2 children. He first started working for the post office in 1987 as a postal officer on the branch office counter. Over an initial 15 years, he progressed to assistant manager and then to acting branch manager. Together with his wife, he purchased Horsepath Post Office, along with a connected village store and apartment. He became Subpostmaster of Horsepath Post Office in January 2002. He financed this purchase through a mortgage and by renting out their property in London as a supplementary source of income. Mr. Patel had a great sense of pride in this role, as his grandfather and uncle had been postmasters in India. He had a great admiration for the post office. But between 2008 and 2010, he had shortfalls. By 2009, he had paid around £10,000 in shortfalls. In January and July 2010, he found shortfalls of £15,000 and £24,000. Following an audit of the branch in December 2010, a significant shortfall was found of £34,673.87. His contract was terminated and he was charged with fraud. He pleaded guilty following advice and was convicted and given an 18-week prison sentence, suspended for 12 months, a 2-month curfew order, and ordered to pay £200 in court costs. The shortfalls shown by the Horizon system were covered by him at significant personal cost. He had to cash in his Royal Mail pension and cash in investments. He had to sell his wife's jewellery, which had been passed down through 3 generations. This was very hurtful, and he says it can never be replaced. The shop declined due to the loss of the post office and the reputational damage which followed his conviction. His wife has had to run the business with his limited assistance. They own the shop and still live on the flat above, but the post office has been closed since 2011. Mr. Patel goes on to talk about the impacts on his health. He suffered, he says, very low mood and from suicidal thoughts, and was prescribed antidepressants. He suffered from panic attacks and developed a phobia of touching money. He was made, he says, to feel like a fraudster and a thief. He wants the inquiry to know that these thoughts persist in his mind all the time. His physical health has also deteriorated. He has been diagnosed with fibromyalgia and is physically disabled. He goes on to speak about the impact upon him following his conviction in the community. Following conviction, he says he was shunned by the local community and was subject to verbal abuse, including racial abuse. His relationship with his wife has been impacted, and his family have been constantly concerned about his welfare. He knows his wife often cries when he is not around. He wants the inquiry to know his children have also had extremely humiliating experiences. Mr. Patel states that despite his conviction now being overturned, the post office has ruined his life. He says he's been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder and told that that will likely continue for the rest of his life. He's been told by his spinal surgeon that he's likely to become paralysed. Mr. Patel says he always knew Horizon was responsible for what happened, but he says he was never listened to. He wants the inquiry to know he trusted the post office and thought he worked for, and this is his words, one of the most iconic, historic, and pioneering institutions on the planet, which helped develop mankind over centuries. Instead, he says, they were deceitful and deceptive. So, I know that you understand there are this first tranche of summaries. There are 2 further summaries to read. They are of a similar length to those that we've read so far.
We're in your hands. If you would like to complete it this afternoon, I think that completes your part, so to speak.
So,
We're very happy to finish this afternoon if you prefer. If you want to have a break and try and fit
So,
it in tomorrow, that's fine.
I'm very happy to continue or to stop.
I think it will probably take up to, say, 10 minutes. So I think we're happy just to finish now. So to carry on to finish.
Indeed.
So, yeah, fine.
Let's continue. I continue with a summary of the evidence of Mr. Robert Ambrose. Mr. Ambrose acquired the High Wyche post office on 5th of May 2010. Prior to this, he and his business partner owned a financial advice company, giving mortgage and property advice. They were both regulated by the Financial Conduct Authority. They were approached by somebody who was looking to sell their post office, and they both thought they bought it and moved their financial advice company to the same premises. Mr. Ambrose's conviction was overturned by the Court of Appeal on 19th July 2021. He says he immediately knew of issues with Horizon, as the number of shortfalls were high, as were the amounts. He said he expected that there would be some minor shortfalls in terms of short change, but the amounts were sometimes huge and unexplained. He says he was continually on the helpline for Horizon, but they denied any issues with the system. The way the post office worked was that it was black or it was white. They denied there were issues in the system and said that Mr. Ambrose was responsible for any shortfalls. He says he would constantly live in fear, waiting for the auditors or for the police to come, as despite his pleas, the post office refused to accept that there were issues within the system. An auditor came to the post office on 9th February 2012. The auditor managed to find discrepancies, and they suspended Mr. Ambrose and closed the post office straight away. At the police station, Mr. Ambrose was charged with theft and false accounting. On 24th September 2012, he appeared at St Albans Crown Court to answer the charges. He was given the opportunity to plead guilty and avoid a custodial sentence. He took it, as he desperately wanted to avoid going to prison. On 28 October 2012, again at St Albans Crown Court, he was sentenced to an 18-month prison sentence, suspended for 2 years, and 250 unpaid hours of community service. At the time of his arrest, he was the director of a regulated financial services company and a financial advisor. This was taken away, along with any possibility of working as a qualified financial advisor again. He lost the ability to earn an income through this means. Mr. Ambrose then, and still, works in employed roles significantly below his experience, knowledge, skills, and capability. He had to leave one of these jobs after a colleague found an internet article regarding his conviction, which led to, again, him being signed off as unfit for work for 6 months due to recurring anxiety and depression. This experience has significantly affected his income, as Mr. Ambrose was a qualified and experienced financial advisor. Following on from the accusation of fraud and false accounting, he became depressed and anxious and had to start on medication. He says he became completely withdrawn and couldn't deal with things in the same way. He says he began drinking excessively and wasn't looking after himself. He wants the inquiry to know that he was in a very bad place mentally. He was no longer working, as due to his mental health issues, he was declared unfit for work. He ended up losing his whole livelihood. In addition, after the audit and the impending arrest, Mr. Ambrose's relationship broke down with his partner, who he had lived with, and he moved out almost immediately, meaning he also lost his home. He says he just wasn't the same person anymore. Not only did people feel they could not trust him, but he felt he couldn't trust anyone else. He grew tired, he says, of repeating the same story over and over again. The impression was that people just thought he was guilty. He says he lost everything overnight. He wants the inquiry to know that money and property and business is one thing, but losing your reputation and dignity is another. Having to question the way you feel about yourself and being constantly in a state of self-doubt is something Mr. Ambrose says he hopes never to experience again. He wants the inquiry to know that now his conviction has been quashed, he is hoping that he can move on with his life again. But he says it's difficult to move on after the last 10 years. And the last summary for today is a summary of the evidence of Mrs. Gail Leslie Ward. Mrs. Gail Leslie Ward is 61 years old and lives with her husband and their dogs. She and her husband have 3 children who've all moved out. At the time of her conviction, her youngest son was 13 years old and still at school. Mrs. Ward first worked for the post office when she was 35 years old at the branch in Swanage. She became branch manager there in 1999. In June 2002, she saw the Priory Road post office in Wells, Somerset, for sale online. She'd been looking for a suitable post office, and the branch also had a property for her and her family to live in. When she became Subpostmaster at Priory Road, she had already been trained on Horizon. Her husband worked with her in the shop for the first 2 years of their ownership, and he received on-site training for Horizon when they opened. At first, she didn't notice any issues with Horizon. At the first audit conducted on her branch, they were only a few pence out. However, Mrs. Ward noticed significant problems beginning towards the end of 2005. She reported these issues to the post office, but was simply told to make good any shortfalls shown by Horizon. She says she continually phoned their helpline to try to manage the errors in the system, and on some occasions she was left in tears. An audit was conducted in January 2007, which she was very nervous for, as she was aware that there were shortfalls showing on Horizon. By this time, she was continually paying money back into the post office to cover the shortfalls. She says, and she recalls, this was hundreds of pounds every week. However, she was relieved that they could now be fixed. Sadly, this was not the case. During the audit, Mrs. Ward says she was told to go upstairs until they finished. She recalls not knowing what was going on. She says, instead of helping her make the system right, she was blamed for the shortfalls. Mrs. Ward recalls, I was told that following the audit they found a shortfall of £12,030.70. She says she couldn't stop crying. She was told to sign something, but she was so upset and was crying, and she had no idea what it was she was signing. She was informed that she had been suspended on the spot. Her keys were taken from her. The post office investigation continued, and she was interviewed twice. Mrs. Ward says of the interviews were degrading, and I felt that nobody believed me. She was interviewed on the 12th of January 2007, but she does not recall when she was interviewed on the second occasion. She remembers she told the interviewers that she couldn't explain the shortages that were alleged. She says she did seek some support from the Federation prior to the interviews, but she says they refused to help her. She says, they simply told me to let them know how I got on. She says, it was as if they didn't believe me either. The Federation was supposed to be our union to back our corner, but they failed me also. Mrs. Ward says that she was told that paying back the alleged shortfall amount would help her case. She recalls that the auditor told her that if he was a gambling man, putting the money right would prevent this from going further. She says she asked friends and family to help her cover the £12,000 within a week of her suspension. She wants the inquiry to know she recalls asking for money from people was mortifying. At the second interview, she was hoping she'd be reinstated by the post office. Instead, on the 22nd of March 2007, they wrote to Mrs. Ward, terminating her contract. Despite an appeal, the position remained the same. Mrs. Ward says of this, they wouldn't listen to me. Despite me stating that there were still financial shortfalls at the same post office, even after I had stopped working there. Mrs. Ward instructed a barrister and a solicitor to represent her at the Crown Court at Bristol on the 15th of October 2007. In court, the post office told her that they would drop the theft charge and she wouldn't go to prison if she pleaded guilty to false accounting. Mrs. Ward says, I had no choice but to accept this, and I pleaded guilty to 4 counts of false accounting. She was given an order to pay £500 in prosecution costs and to undertake 150 hours of unpaid work. After the conviction, she tried to sell the shop and the post office. She had a buyer approved by the post office. However, the post office then closed the branch and the buyer pulled out. She lost all her salary from the post office, and as they had no money to stock the shop, they lost that too. Mrs. Ward and her husband had mounting debts, and she tried to sell personal items at car boot sales just to have enough money to buy food. She says, and she wants the inquiry to know, she was completely traumatised throughout the criminal proceedings, and she was terrified, especially when she was told that she could receive a custodial sentence. She says, on the day before the final hearing, my solicitor told me to pack a bag, and I had to say goodbye to my 13-year-old son in case I was unable to come back home following the hearing. It was heartbreaking, and I had no idea what would happen. She recalls collapsing in the dock once she received the sentence from the court, and she had to be helped out by her husband. She says, it was a relief I could go home to my children, but I still had a criminal conviction to deal with, along with the financial difficulties I had to face. Mrs. Ward says she knew her conviction was wrong. She was innocent and had tried everything she could to make things right, even at her own financial expense. As a result of these financial expenses, she was forced to declare bankruptcy. After her conviction, she became socially withdrawn. She says people would be gossiping and saying, "There's no smoke without fire." She now struggles with trusting people and says she has no confidence socially. As to her health, Mrs. Ward started developing chest pain, which was put down to anxiety. She says she used to be a positive person, but now only sees things in a negative light. She wants the inquiry to know, we lost everything. She stresses, the fact that the post office was aware of the issues with Horizon, yet criminalised their staff, is something that will always make me very angry and distressed. She says, since her conviction was quashed, she can now start looking people in the eye again. And she says she is no longer a criminal. She wants the inquiry to know that her memories of this experience will always stay with her. Finally, she says the post office prosecution and conviction ruined everything she worked so hard for. Thank you, sir.
Right. So is it 10 o'clock in the morning, Miss Hodge? Very well. 10 o'clock tomorrow morning.